Well, welcome to the Unstoppable Freedom Podcast. I'm Jimmy Page. Well, I've said this many times before, but as a girl dad, there are two things I never thought I'd have to worry about. The first thing is I never thought girls and women would be forced to compete in sports against boys and men. And the second thing is this: I never thought boys and men would be allowed in private spaces of girls and women, like bathrooms and locker rooms. But incredibly, that's exactly the world we're living in. And I got to tell you, I've coached both boys and girls teams for many, many years. And let me state the obvious. There is a significant difference in the speed, power, strength, agility, endurance, all of it between boys and girls. That's not just my opinion, but that's a physiological fact. We are right now, watching men compete against, dominate, and cause harm to women in sports all across the world. We're watching as they take opportunities and awards. And it's time to say enough is enough. The fight to protect women and girls in sports is far from over. Well, our guest today has been speaking truth and standing up for women and children for 2 decades now. Her name is Jennifer Sey. She's an author, filmmaker, business executive, and the 1986 U.S. Women's All-Around National Champion in Artistic Gymnastics. Jennifer wrote the book Chalked Up, which exposed abuses in the sport of gymnastics. She's produced the powerful 2020 Emmy Award-winning documentary Athlete A on Netflix. She's written Levi's Unbuttoned, detailing how the woke mob took her job but gave her her voice. And today, most importantly today, she's the founder and CEO of her own clothing brand, XXXY Athletics, the only athletic brand to stand up for women's sports and female athletes. Jen, it's an honor to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Okay,
so you've been, speaking the truth and standing up for women and children now for really almost 2 decades. That's quite a run. You've been fearless in many ways. I wonder if you've always been fearless. Has this just been part of your DNA?
No, and I don't even really consider myself fearless. I consider myself sort of naive. I care a lot about the truth, and I care a lot about protecting children, and I sort of start down a path before I realize what the impact might be or the blowback. And then when people tell me I can't say something is when I say, well, yes, I can. So I decide to keep going usually. But yeah, I was an elite gymnast as a child. I was a 7-time national team member and the 1986 national champion. And I left the sport in 1988, a few months before the Olympic trials, completely just broken physically and emotionally because of the abusive training environment. Wow. And 20 years later, I was like a totally normal person, right? I had 2 kids. I had a really good job. I was already a pretty senior executive at Levi's. I was married. But I really suffered from the abuse that had occurred. And, with low self-esteem, I had really bad imposter syndrome, which a lot of type A women have, I guess. But just anxiety, terrible nightmares. I just really struggled still. And I, as a thinking and introspective person, wanted to understand that. And so I sat down and wrote my first book. And I just pledged to be as honest as I could. What was it like? And to really try to understand why that might impact the person I am right now.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot about myself, and I didn't really think I would get it published. I wasn't a writer. I thought I might be able to write a decent book, but I was not a writer. I was a corporate executive.
Right.
But I did get it published. And, I had pledged to myself to be as honest as I could. I didn't think about the impact. I was sitting in my room writing it myself. And I think it was the honesty that was the reason I was able to get it published. And we published it just a couple months before the Olympics in 2008. And this was really way before anybody was talking about abuse in gymnastics. It was way before Me Too. And so the backlash was swift and it was quite brutal. In terms of my teammates, my USA national teammates, the coaching community, USAG itself, the governing body calling me, threatening voicemails, that kind of thing. The image of gymnastics is happy, shiny, bouncy little girls prancing around. Well, that's what they drive sponsorship dollars off of. And so if there's truth to the fact that girls are systematically, emotionally, physically, and sexually abused, that kind of interferes with that brand image.
Yeah, just a little bit. Jeez.
Just a little, yeah. So it was tough, the broader world kind of was intrigued by it, but my community, and by my community, I mean athletes, Olympians, athletes who trained in the Olympic movement were like, she is a liar and a grifter and a horrible person, and we are going to threaten her and call her names until she stops.
Wow.
And I didn't stop. But this was early days of social media, so I did not know how brutal it could be. So it was pretty emotionally draining, but it ultimately strengthened my resolve, and I think made me tougher. But my point with that is I didn't know what I was getting into.
Yeah. Right. So you weren't fearless at the time. You, like you said, you were naive. You're thinking, no, I'm going to tell the truth. I'm a truth teller, which, by the way, the truth is kind of up for grabs right now. And it's why the truth matters and why we have to stand for the truth. So you're naive. You're thinking, I'm just going to tell my story and I'm going to expose this. And you got a lot of blowback. It's interesting that you said that they had to protect the brand. They really had to protect the brand. And you know a lot about branding, obviously, in your career. As that started to happen, as you started to get the blowback, why were the athletes not willing to support you?
That's a good question. And I've really thought about that a lot. And I think for a lot of people, they really look back at their time in sport as this perfect time, and they set all the bad stuff aside. And they may have also been suffering from some of these repercussions. I'll tell you a very specific story in 1 second, but I think they're protecting their memory of the sport so that they don't, they're still afraid of their coaches 20 years later. They still are seeking the, compliment, because that's what happens when you're an abused child.
Yeah.
You're desperately chasing the approval of the coaches. And I even myself, who was willing to write this book, was like, oh gosh, what are they going to think of me? And then I thought, why do I care what these people think of me? They're horrible human beings. They've been abusing children for 50 years. Yes. So, but they still are chasing that. I mean, that's what abused children do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they think it's their fault that they were abused. I mean, a therapist explained it to me once. He said, when a mother beats her child or a father beats their child, they don't say, I'm sorry. They say, I wouldn't have to hit you if you didn't do that thing. Right. So the child internalizes that and thinks it's their fault. That's every gymnast I ever trained with.
Gosh, it's just amazing. I remember when the kind of the veneer of this came off, because I remember the Athlete A documentary. And I remember watching this, I was thinking it's powerful. It's heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking, infuriating, inspiring, all those things kind of at the same time. So you're watching this documentary, which, by the way, was just amazing. And you're thinking, you want to throw some stuff. You want to hold people responsible. You can't believe it's happening. When that documentary came out, tell us about, was that different? Was that received differently than your first book?
Well, it was, because it was after Me Too, and it was after Larry Nassar had gone to prison for life. Yeah. So here, I'll give you I was going to give you an example. A woman I know, an Olympian from 1980 and 1984. Of course, the 80 team didn't go. That was a boycott, but she was an Olympian in 84, a medalist. It was a friend. She doesn't like me much anymore, but that's more COVID related than gymnastics.
Oh, we're going to get into COVID too.
I know. She would call me and she would say, because I was like, we can't do this like the right way. We can't go to USAG and say, we really would like you to change your policies. They aren't going to. I mean, now we know they were hiding and destroying evidence of Larry Nassar's crimes. Like, they were not going to try to do the right thing. So my strategy, maybe this is the marketer in me, was like, we're going to go to the press and we're going to blow this shit up.
Yep.
And ultimately that is what started to change things. But this Olympian would call me and she'd say, you're being too aggressive. We have to be nice. Let's go sit down and talk to them. But that's the wanting the approval. It's wanting to be in that community still. This is a very powerful tie. I'm going to bring it up when we talk about COVID. Yeah. You want to be with most people would rather be with the group, be welcomed by the group, feel like they're in the in-group, than stand apart and do the right thing. And for gymnasts and young athletes who grow up in serious, that is their community. Like, it was really hurtful to me to be kind of banished from that community. And most people aren't willing to do it. And most people, or a lot of people that trained at my level, still are very involved with the sport. They're judges or coaches, or their kids do it. I had nothing to do with the sport. So it was almost easier for me in a sense. I had a separate career. So I don't know. There's like this, they're a little bit stunted.
Mm-hmm.
That's mean. And they just still want the approval of that community, and they want to be in that community. Another friend of mine who was very aggressive with me when the book came out, called in on the radio, threatened lawsuits and all this sort of stuff, later called me a few years later, and she said, I was abused by one of our coaches. I'm sorry what I did to you. I wasn't really ready to deal with it yet. You were right about everything.
Wow. And
So,
you feel vindicated, but at the same time, you understand how difficult it is for those athletes to come out and tell the truth, because there's so, you think about it, there's all this pressure to make the team. It's like every athletics, right? Everyone wants to make the team. So you want to be part of that thing so desperately, so that then when you become, right? When you become part of it, it's like, your whole identity
is tied to it. It is. I mean, I, to this day, feel like no one understands me, or at least certain aspects of who I am and how I behave, better than people I trained with when I was 11. Like, no one understands what it's like to train 10 hours a day on a possibly broken ankle on 300 calories. It's just, they understand you, or at least they understand what your childhood was like, even if you're not the same now. So I think a lot of people don't want to contend with what actually happened. I do also think there's a lot of people, and Athlete A sort of blew the doors open on this, so I'm going to get to that. They don't relate to the tales of abuse. Maybe they weren't sexually abused. I was not sexually abused. I was around pedophiles, and I was told to avoid them, which is harmful in and of itself, because it's saying this man's reputation matters more than you do as a child. But I myself was not sexually abused. And so because that was the story with Nasser, I think a lot of women, I mean, I've been calling what I experienced physical and emotional abuse for years. And a lot of people believe, like I do, that the physical and emotional abuse sort of creates the conditions for sexual abuse to occur. Because at that point, the child is so upside down and doesn't know right from wrong, and thinks they're the problem and they're to blame. If you weren't so fat, I wouldn't have to yell at you and deny you food. If you weren't so lazy, I wouldn't have to make you do 2 extra hours of conditioning. That makes a kid upside down. So you can imagine that in the case of Larry Nasser, who's not a coach, but a team doctor, who basically sexually assaulted young women under the guise of medical treatment, that this is a child that's kind of turned upside down from the abuse. She goes into his office. He says, I have to put my hand in. Well, he doesn't even tell them. He just does it. And they're like, but my wrist hurts. And he says, yeah, I need to do this. And they're upside down already, and they don't feel, this is a well-respected doctor. They don't feel like they can say anything if they're uncomfortable, all that stuff. So a lot of, point being, when Athlete A came out, one of the things I really wanted to convey was that this is not a one bad apple situation, which is what USA Gymnastics wanted you to believe. This is a rotten sport to the core, and this is a man that was able to abuse for 30 years because the culture is rotten and covered up for him. That's the first thing. And also that emotional and physical abuse do create the environment for sexual abuse to occur. And so a lot of women, when that film came out, which again was post Me Too and post Nasser going to prison, called me. I mean, when I say a lot, I mean hundreds of elite gymnasts from around the world called to say, I didn't realize that I too was abused, that type of treatment, physical and emotional abuse, training on broken bones, being bullied and fat shamed, foods taken out of our hands. I mean, slapped on the, they say, I didn't realize, I thought I was weak. That was hard for me to endure, but that was because I was weak. And I said, that's what the abusers depend on. So the film really, it started this whole social media thing where it was hashtag Gymnast Alliance, where people were publishing their stories of abuse. And I tried to read all of them. And I would say 90% of them were not sexual abuse, but were startling stories of emotional and physical abuse.
Wow. I was thinking too that you talked about they created this environment for abuse. And I think about how it was so systemic, right, in that sport. And I have to believe it's not just that sport, but I think it's easiest in that sport in some ways, obviously. But I think, you talk about creating that environment, I think about the grooming that's going on today. we need to get to the COVID thing, because the same environment that created the potential for this kind of abuse in the gymnastics world, and really in all of athletics, that same environment, that same predatory mindset exists everywhere in our culture right now. So let's fast forward a little bit to 2020. Let's talk about, I know here you are, you're the global brand president of Levi's. You have this, I mean, it's a little bit shocking actually to me that you got hired in this capacity given your past advocacies. It's almost like in some ways they want to associate with the past advocacies because this is powerful. You advocated for young girls, young athletes, et cetera. But at the same time, if you ever advocate for something they don't believe in, or the narrative that, you know, you kind of cross their narrative like you did, this is going to end badly. So in 2020, you're the global brand president of Levi's, a huge brand. You lived in San Francisco, which is known to be one of the more liberal town, I'm being kind now, liberal towns in the world. And you decided to speak up against the harm being done to children, specifically about these extended school closings at the time. Tell us about that. What happened then?
That was tough. Yeah, I ended up working at Levi's for 23 years, which I'm very proud of. I worked myself, worked up from the ground floor all the way to brand president. I feel like I did a lot of good to help reinvent that brand. They would absolutely 1,000% say the same thing. I helped lead the IPO in 2019. It's a brand I love and wore for many years, even before I worked there, and still wear. I think they're the best jeans in the world. But
a lot of people would agree with you. That's what makes it so hard to stop buying Levi's.
You raise a good point, and I want to come back to this because one of the reasons I started XXXY Athletics is I don't think you should have to sacrifice fit, quality, style, ethical manufacturing to buy a brand that aligns with your values. And for the most part, you do have to sacrifice those things to buy a brand, but you don't with us. Okay. This is another example of my naivete, I think, to some extent, getting me in trouble. As soon as COVID lockdowns struck, which was around, I think, March 13th, 2020 in San Francisco, it was one of the first cities to lock down and close schools, if not the first, of course. Yeah. Of course. My husband and I, from day one, were like, hell no, this is not, this is really, really bad. This is bad for children. This is bad for low income people. This is basically bad for everyone, except maybe the rich people who can get Uber Eats all day long and have a house and a yard and all these things. And outside of it being bad, they aren't going to end it in 2 weeks, like they said. They're just going to move. We knew all of this from the beginning. And it's a gross violation of our civil liberties. No matter how dangerous it is, if it's that dangerous, people are going to stay home.
Yes.
Like it just smelled to high heaven from the very beginning. And I would have never called myself a libertarian. I mean, at the time I was far left, whatever, but I was just like, no.
Which I personally, Jen, I cannot reconcile that, but we'll talk about that. Jeez.
About being a lefty?
Yeah.
I felt like, and you can laugh at this, but the left were the champions of free speech in the past.
Yeah, they used to be. It's true.
So I thought the left cared about the vulnerable. I thought the left cared about women and children. And so to me, everything that happened during COVID was it was trespass of their own stated values. The left was the anti-war party. Right. They're not anymore.
Exactly. It's interesting to watch this switch happen in real time.
That's why I was a lefty.
I get it.
So if there aren't those things anymore, then I'm not going to be a lefty. And then you have to go like, were you ever? I mean, I think they were in some ways, but that's beside the point. The world has changed is really the point. Yeah. And, wokeness became ascendant, probably starting early to mid 2010s. And then obviously in the summer of 2020 is when it really kind of exploded in corporate America. And COVID was a piece of this whole sort of woke ideology in a way. And anyway, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I didn't have a lot of followers. I just started saying like, this doesn't seem right. And I was super nice and like diplomatic and I'd cite facts and stuff. And you can imagine how few of us there were in San Francisco. Oh my gosh.
I can't even imagine. You must have been I think like a pebble in the playground,
I think it was basically just me and my husband. And I mean, I would even argue nationally,
Yeah.
there were very few. I mean, most Republicans, most libertarians, most everybody who should have been. Now, Republicans and libertarians got there sooner. I think the Democrats would still say lockdowns worked. But nobody in the beginning, I mean, even Ron DeSantis famously talks about how he locked down because his state is very old. There's a lot of old people and he didn't want to do the wrong thing. But as soon as he read the data, you know, he changed his mind. Right. But anyway, we were just very outspoken, mostly on social media, but I called into school board meetings as well. That was kind of it. And I didn't really have a large following. I mean, almost nobody. I was like nobody on social media, but it grew and built traction. And at a certain point, you know, at first no one was noticing. It was like a tree falling in the forest. And then at a certain point, people were noticing and people started posting my address online, pictures of my house. So it was like the whole city of San Francisco turned against me. I mean, I got chased down the street. Somebody recognized me from my Twitter. This woman screamed at me that she wouldn't care when my children died because I was a murderer and an evil person. So it was a pretty, it was pretty brutal, but I kept going because they kept pushing it. And then I really started to see the harm to not just my kids, but other children. It was widely reported on. And I really focused on children, even though I was opposed to all of it. We ended up moving in the spring of 21 so that our kids could go to school.
Wow. Where did you move to?
We moved, don't laugh.
Yeah.
We moved to Denver.
Come on, let's go. You're right down the street.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm in Fort Collins.
Oh, okay. We're neighbors. I moved to Colorado because the schools were open and it was relatively close to San Francisco. Like I could get there and back in a day if I needed to go to work, that kind of thing. And people laugh because it is very blue in Denver. But my son started school March 1st, 2021, literally started kindergarten. You know, he'd missed the first half and he didn't miss a day. It was not totally normal. He had to wear a mask, but there were no closures, no nothing. So we were grateful for that.
Yes.
You know,
amazing.
But anyway,
but you were threatened, physically threatened. You were threatened in every respect in San Francisco to the point where you had to move in order to escape that. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. And people were posting randoms on social media, were posting about, you know, tagging my employer, things like that. People started a petition. I mean, it wasn't a lot of people, but whatever. Like people were like, this is a horrible murderer, grifter, liar. She's killing people and she doesn't deserve to live in polite society or have a job or anything. And so that was really harrowing. And it was a decision every day to kind of continue, but schools were still closed. Jimmy, I mean, that was the thing.
Right.
You know, and 2-year-olds were still masked and it was still awful. And we were all demonized and censored and all that. So eventually a year later in the spring of 22, I resigned. I, you know, didn't want to move back to San Francisco. I didn't.
So real quick, how did Levi's, so I'm envisioning, by the way, COVID for me was also, you know, I call it the great exposure because it gave us an opportunity to sit in. For me, I got to sit in on a virtual class with my daughter and hear the political and social indoctrination. I couldn't believe it. I was feeding her facts, which is evidently not acceptable. And she would share it. And I witnessed her getting bullied by her teacher and classmates in class in real time. And I said, okay, that's it. And that for me was.
How old was she?
She was a sophomore in high school, junior in high school. And I was like, okay, that's the end of it. I'm getting involved. I actually left my my divisional position with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes and said, I'm jumping into this fight for freedom because I saw our individual liberties getting eroded, getting crushed in real time. So COVID was that for me too. And, you know, I would like you, I went as soon as we could go to the board meetings, I would go to the board meetings and give our public comments. And we were ridiculed. We were escorted out by police who later became very good friends because they knew the whole thing was nonsense. So, yeah, I can relate to this idea of what that fight looks like, you know?
It was tough. And it was a choice every day to continue. And at a certain point, you're in so deep that you're like, well, it doesn't even matter if I stop now. I'm screwed.
So as you're doing this and you move, what's Levi's? I mean, I know you did a big campaign for Levi's talking about using your voice, which becomes real ironic all of a sudden. You're using your voice. What did they say? How did they respond during this time?
I mean, it was, it was a difficult dynamic. It was, without kind of getting into details about it, they're in my book. People can read that. It was certainly challenging. I think, as it would have been in any corporation in America. Every corporation in America was pretty on board with all of the COVID restrictions. I mean, CEOs from other companies were coming after me and targeting me. And, I think it's also worth noting that most of the people in the C-suite, I'm not even being specific to Levi's here. Most people in the C-suite had kids in private school that were already attending school in person. My kids actually do go to public school. And so I know that population, that student population, I knew that they would be suffering. And I just was so offended by the hypocrisy of C-suiters saying you can't stand up and advocate for open public schools while they're sending their own children to private school. Like the whole, I'm more than anything, I think I'm a traitor to my class. And that just really gets people
right.
Angry.
You became an enemy because you were one of them, so to speak, and you were speaking out against the disparities that children were experiencing based upon their economic strata.
While
you had to be silenced.
While the summer of 2020 happens and every corporation in America is hiring massive DEI departments and saying we are pledging to fight racism. And I'm saying on social media, if you want to fight racism, open the schools.
Exactly.
Because the most structurally racist policy imaginable to me is keeping Black children out of school. And the public schools are disproportionately populated by Black and brown children. Me going through DEI training is not going to help this cause. And so I just, at a certain point, I just, was frustrated. It was hard for me to be there. I wanted to be able to use my voice in the way that I believed was right. And, I'm trying now in the company that I have to give the employees that space as well. Obviously we agree, and we'll talk about the brand on this issue. We definitely do not agree on everything. The people that work in my company, and they can say whatever they want on social media. It's one thing if you're representing the brand, but everyone has the right to say what they think. I just realized I couldn't really be in a large corporate structure and be true to myself and have integrity, basically. So for me, I thought I will, take this. I will be proud of my 23 years, and I will take this moment to, depart, especially since I don't want to move back to San Francisco and I want to retain my voice. I took a break after that, but I did go back into interviewing because I'm the breadwinner, and I thought, well, I need to work, right? And I learned very quickly that I would not be welcome back into corporate America. Because the whole thing in corporate America is you read the script, and I had refused to read the script. So.
You cut your marketability in half at least. I know I had Andrew
to zero.
Right. Well, thanks for joining us for part one of this two-part series with Jen Sey, the founder and CEO of XXXY Athletics. Things are just heating up, so stay tuned for part two. See you then.